Hello and welcome to TE Present Teacher. And this is the episode 11, and we are going to talk about critical thinking and teaching students critical thinking in the classroom. So we'll try to first break down what critical thinking actually is, and then what it means for us in the classroom as teachers. How do we get students to bring this skill into their repertoire? And for that, we have Ritu, who's going to be talking about this. Hi, Ritu.
Hi.
So today we want to talk about critical thinking, and it is one of those things that has been mentioned multiple times in the NEP 2020, and there is a lot of push for creating the skill in students in the recent past and in the present. I mean, there's no doubt that it's a critical skill to have. So I just wanted to understand first that there is a push for it. So what's the reason for it? And B, why is it so difficult to teach critical thinking to students?
I think for very long, our entire education system has relied on rote learning, and it has a lot of effect on real life situations when we're not able to think critically. And I think that's something that all educators know and are aware of, and including this as an important emphasis in the NEP 2020 is probably coming from that. And I think this is well known. So I won't go into much detail of that. I think the more important point here is that it's well and good that it's in the policy, but teaching critical thinking, like you said, is not easy at all. One of the main reasons being that mm, we don't even know what thinking is. There's no clear definition of it. So if we can't define what it is, having an approach, having a structure, having trainings around it for teachers, for students is very difficult. So I think that's one of the main points. And second, of course, something that we've talked about a lot is that critical thinking in itself is a very difficult process for any human being.
So you're saying that
And
even doing critical thinking or practicing critical thinking is difficult. So teaching it is a different level. Is that what you're saying?
yes, for anyone to think critically is
Hmm.
difficult. So teaching it is even more so. Teaching how to teach it even more than that. So that's where I think one of the main aspects of that problem lies.
Right. And I think take a step back first. Even before we get into critical thinking, let's just talk about thinking. And there is this understanding that thinking itself is hard, and it is not something that the brain wants to do, apparently. So can you just shed a little bit of light on it quickly as to why we think forget critical thinking, but just thinking is hard?
Yeah. And the simple answer to that is that the brain is a lazy organ. It's a better way of putting it is that it's an energy preserving organ. It doesn't want to spend energy. It wants to conserve energy as much as possible. And that is why doing things that we're very used to, like following a particular route to a market that we go to very often, is easier for us than trying to figure out a new route to a new market. Because when we're doing something familiar, the processes in our brain, the pathways in our brain that store that information don't have to do work. But when we have to try and acquire new information, like what the new route is, there are a lot of things working together. There's the visual system working, there's the motor system working. A lot of parts of our brain need to work together, create these new pathways, which takes up a lot of energy. The brain, as much as possible, wants to try and save energy, and any new thinking requires a lot of energy, which it doesn't really like doing.
Right. And so that brings me very nicely onto the next point. And we wrote about this recently also in our newsletters. There are some things that the brain evolved to do. Through years of evolution, there were things that were needed for human survival, like looking at something, so observing, and things like that. And clearly, critical thinking apparently was not needed in this case, right? So the things that were needed for my survival as an early human, they're this probably called primary, and anything that the brain is doing now, like writing, reading, these things were not really needed for survival for the early human, and those are secondary. So clearly, critical thinking seems to be a secondary skill, right?
Yeah. And I think you've put it really well. Anything that I need for survival, the brain is adapted to do, it's easy to do, it doesn't take up too much energy, and the brain is more than happy if you keep doing the same thing over and over again. That is why routines are so easy to fall into, and it's so difficult to break out of routines. Whereas anything that requires parts of the brain to work together that were not really meant to work together, like you said, reading, writing, higher order mathematical skills, critical thinking, which, if we have to define it, basically means taking disparate pieces of knowledge in our brain which are not connected and forming new connections between them to form a new hypothesis, a synthesis, whatever, an opinion, which is secondary, which is not really needed for survival.
Right. And I can see that from if you put a lens of early humans, and this is again an example that we've used in the newsletter also, early human survival depended on them taking the safety first approach. So, for example, if they saw one of their people in their group eat a red fruit and say die or have a major sickness, then they probably took a decision that okay, you know what, we're not going to eat any red fruits. It's dangerous to eat red fruits. Not a very critically thought out process, but anecdotally it made them safe, right? It was just a safety first approach. So maybe anecdotal evidence and taking decisions based on one of those examples is probably more primary versus critical thinking would be to test out every red fruit and see how badly it affects your body, and probably they didn't want to do that. I mean, for obvious reasons of safety. So yeah, I understand what you're saying, that okay, critical thinking, a the brain is not wired to think critically, and given that brain doesn't have the tendency to use too much energy to create these new connections, it's going to be hard in the first place. So good. I mean, I think it's a good example in the sense of understanding what critical thinking is and why it is so hard for all human beings. So I think that's a nice way to start off, because I think a lot of times people get upset about people not thinking critically, and it's just that we have to understand that hey, we were never meant to. I mean, we should now, definitely, but our brains are not the organs which are going to do it naturally. And so that skill needs to be kind of taught. Great. So now when I'm thinking of critical thinking, how do I break this down now? Okay, I know that okay, this is critical thinking and this is how a brain is going to work with it. Is there a theory where we can break down critical thinking into some of its components, which would help us teach critical thinking? That's where we want to head, right?
Right. So I think, like I mentioned a couple of minutes back, if we have to break it down into its bare components, critical thinking is basically making connections between disparate pieces of knowledge to come up with something that is slightly out of the box or not very apparent. And the first thing that anyone needs to be able to think critically in any area is background knowledge. If I don't know much about a particular topic, I may be able to read about it, I may be able to learn about it, I may be able to gather knowledge about it. Thinking critically about it is going to take a very, very long time. No one can be expected to think critically about something that they don't know really well. For example, I know when I'm scrolling through social media and I come across a post on cryptocurrency. Very often I can read all the words. I know what each word means individually. Maybe I don't know a couple of the words because they're new terms, but I know about 90% of the terms or the words individually. None of it makes sense together for me. I have zero ability to think critically when it comes to something like cryptocurrency. But I may be able to think critically when it comes to topics that I'm really, really passionate about and I know a lot about, like some topics in education,
Right.
which I've spent a lot of time learning about.
Right. I mean, I get that anecdote, because I think A lot of times, I mean, I'm going to use examples from my life. Uh, I love cricket, watching cricket, playing cricket, and there are multiple statistics in cricket which are not intuitive. And if someone who doesn't follow cricket is trying to ask me that, and it's hard to explain why it actually explains some very identifiable characteristic of a batter or a bowler in the game. So I get what you're saying. It's you need the background knowledge of why, what everything means in the cricket, what are the rules, etc. And only then I can appreciate that one number as a statistic. So yeah, I think that creating that background knowledge is probably the first step of building critical thinking in students, right?
Yes, and having a separate class for critical thinking is not going to help anyone at all. Subject teachers need to first focus on building subject knowledge and only then using that subject knowledge to start building critical thinking skills.
Right. And that is why I think even people who are experts in the field are the ones who are being able to be more critically analyze things in their field. And that's why even researchers need to spend so much time first building their body of knowledge and then saying that, hey, this is what we think is happening. And I think there's another word, I mean, there's another phrase that people use for it, is that you understand the surface details or surface structure of the information provided to you, right? um, so what then?
And so the second part of critical thinking is understanding the deep structure. So we've understood the surface structure, which are the basic details that we need. And then there is something called the deep structure, or a more understandable term is the underlying principle of this knowledge. And I think Daniel Willingham, who is a very well respected cognitive psychologist, has provided a couple of really good examples of what deep structure means. And this is an example we've discussed many times about the fort and the soldiers. So maybe we could discuss that right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't we just explain that example of the fort?
So there is this scenario where a teacher is telling students a story about a fort which has been captured by an evil king, an evil ruler, and the army general wants to ensure that the fort is taken back and the citizens have full use of that area. So there's a plan to recapture the fort. And the way the fort is built is that the fort is in the middle, and then there are roads leading out of it, like the spokes of a wheel all around it. So there's a circle and there are spokes leading out. And so the army general wants to come and capture the fort, I'm sorry. And when they're planning to do this, out that there are landmines under the paths leading to the fort, which will detonate when there's a lot of weight on them. But they won't detonate if the weight is a little lower. So they're trying to figure out how to recapture the fort, and they know that they can't send only a few soldiers in because the fort is too powerful, the king is too powerful. They need to send their entire force in. But if they do that, the landmines will detonate. They they think critically about this, and they plan to send in a few soldiers on every path, and so the weight on any one path is not too high. And they all then converge on the fort in huge numbers safely. And that's how they recapture the fort. So this is a story that the students have been told. They know it, they understand it, they know all the details of the story. So that's the first part of this little exercise that we're doing. Um, yeah, and I think you can take it from there.
Right. And then I think what happens in this study is that the teacher asks the students a different question and says that, there's this therapy for cancer where you need to shine radiation on the tumor. And there's a tumor inside the stomach of a patient. However, the intensity that is needed to kill the cancer is also going to kill the normal cells. So you can't have that level of intensity of radiation going through your body. So what is a way to kind of cure this cancer or try to get the tumor reduced? And the teacher asked the students to come up with the answer. And the students struggle for a little while. And apparently just 1 in 5 students is able to solve this. this question? The answer is obviously that not obviously, but if you see the answer, you'll understand what we are getting to, that you shine low intensity radiations from all around the patient so that the radiation converges on the tumor and the tumor experiences the highest intensity with low intensity waves coming from all different directions. That is the difference. That 1 in 5 student who could answer this question was probably going a little deeper in their thinking. The surface details in both these puzzles were absolutely different. Like there was a war in one and there was a medical science issue in the other. However, if you see the deep structure, I think was very similar, right? So those are the kind of connections you need to make for critical thinking. Is that an accurate way of putting it?
Yeah. So critical thinking is basically being able to make these connections again between disparate pieces of knowledge to come to this general underlying principle that low intensity from different paths will lead to high intensity in the middle. And in both these cases, that's the solution. And similarly, I think if to make it more relatable to teachers, I'll give an example from reading, which is that we read different genres of stories, and that's great. It's great to be exposed to different genres, but the critical thinking comes in when we're able to come to the underlying principle of these genres. So if a kid is able to read a story about a colony of humans settled on Mars, the surface details of that would be that we're on a different planet, there are people, there are struggles with water, oxygen, all of those things. Maybe there's a war at the end of it, whatever the story is. But the underlying principle is that if once you read different stories of this genre of science fiction, you should be able to come to the understanding that science fiction is always set in an impossible scenario which is based on a scientific invention that is fictional in our current world, but human beings are still acting as human beings, emotions are still playing out, all of that still remains the same. So that is where critical thinking comes in, to be able to say, okay, this is what the underlying principle of science fiction really is.
Right. I think that's a very good point. That critical thinking doesn't need to be this defined puzzle or question that you ask in a classroom. Critical thinking is to also look at these patterns and come up with, a general principle, general underlying principle that you have mentioned. So I think that that's a good place to kind of pause and say that, okay, I think we have an idea of what critical thinking is and how our brain processes things. So now, obviously, the question is, what does that mean for me in the classroom? What does that mean for me as an
Mhm.
educator?
Hi, we have developed an amazing tool to help teachers plan their lessons, TEPS, or Things Education's pedagogical strategies. TEPS helps teachers by reducing the time that they spend on planning lessons. TEPS also helps you if you want to try a different pedagogical approach to teaching. So, if you want to know how to teach a topic in a project based or inquiry based or even constructivist learning approach, TEPS is for you. TAPS helps even seasoned teachers with fresh ideas on how to teach specific topics. So, scan the QR code on the screen or visit taps.school and join a community of empowered educators. Great teaching begins with TAPS.
So let's try and break that down. So now I'm a teacher who wants to actually teach for critical thinking. And please understand, I'm saying teach for critical thinking, not teach critical thinking. So how do we go about doing it?
So I think like we've mentioned in all of our conversations and many of our newsletters, the first step for any teacher is to decide the learning outcomes. What will students achieve at the end of each class in terms of their learning, um, is what we want to start with. And when we sit down to write our learning outcomes, the way we need to think about it is exactly what we said a while back, that there is surface knowledge that students need to build. And only when they have that surface knowledge, the knowledge of the details of any concept, can they go deeper into it and understand its deep structure or its underlying principles. So starting with writing a learning outcome for the surface knowledge and for the deep learning or the deep structure is the first step.
Right. And as an example, you can see this?
We can see learning outcomes for a few different subjects and a few different grades. Um, and for example, if I'm a civics teacher or a political science teacher, um, and I want to teach students to think critically about how the government works, how the branches of the government. The first step still has to be students understanding what these three different branches of the government are, what their functions are, what their responsibilities are, without going into details of how they influence each other or any of those things. Just the surface details of what they are is the first step for me.
Right. And that will be your learning outcome that you've written down for the surface structure knowledge. And then
Yes.
say we go into the deeper structure. And as a teacher, I would want to write down learning outcome to create that deeper structure knowledge in the student. So how do we go about doing that?
And so once I have my surface structure learning outcome ready, now I need to think about what is it, where does critical thinking happen? Critical thinking happens once I know how these different branches of the government interact, how they influence each other, how they balance each other out. And so my deep structure learning outcome will be something around the separation of powers, why that's important. And that's where we want our students to get to, not just stay at what these different branches are, but also understand why they're needed, why the balance of powers is needed.
Right, exactly. So now the second part is going to help them critically analyze any situation that will come up in the context of the different wings of the government in a democracy. Right? That's where we want the students to get at. So again, I think I'm just going to reiterate this part that that's why we say we are teaching for critical thinking. It's not that we are teaching critical thinking in itself, but if we give them these kinds of tools, the students are going to be able to think critically. And then you give them a problem to solve, etc. Then the critical thinking is going to come through in the students as well. I'm just going to pause here a little bit and ask you a little bit about the pedagogical approaches for surface structure knowledge and deep structure knowledge. Do you think there's a difference, or are there some generalizations that we can make?
So when it comes to surface structure knowledge, this is the first time that students are being exposed to these concepts. And so we think that taking a direct instruction approach when we're introducing students to knowledge for the first time is probably going to be the most effective way, where we have clear explanation of the topic, maybe a small activity to understand what it is, but highly supported by the teacher, very clear discussions that are led by the teacher and summarized. That is probably one of the most effective ways to introduce new knowledge. Whereas once students have that surface structure knowledge, once they're comfortable with all of that knowledge in their mind, and we've now gone on to trying to get to the underlying principle, that's where using a more inquiry-based approach, where students are taking a little more of the lead, where they are given a question and they have to figure it out, that not only promotes critical thinking, but also ensures that the more difficult process of getting to this underlying structure, underlying principle is something that students approach in a way that they're most comfortable with, asking questions that they are struggling with, and using resources that are going to help them the most. That's where inquiry-based learning really, really helps. So, and of course, we can always support that with direct instruction, but as a general approach, this is something we feel will work best with these two types of knowledge.
Right, makes sense. And just to end this, a lot of things that we've spoken about critical thinking, I see a lot of parallels with creative thinking as well. What do you think on that?
I think there are definitely a lot of overlaps between critical thinking and creative thinking. Both of them sort of require a lot of basic knowledge, not just basic knowledge, deep knowledge of any concept. Both of them require you to be able to step back, zoom out, and see connections that are not very apparent. So I think there are quite a few overlaps in those two cases, in those two aspects of these two types of thinking.
Right, and the thing of looking beyond the obvious, right? I mean, now this example has become really famous, where where a mathematician was asked how to save money on the World War II planes. think his name was Abraham Wald, and he kind of looked at the pattern of bullets on a plane, which on the planes that had come back from Europe in the US, and everyone had suggested reinforcing places where the bullets were. They wanted to reinforce the plane in those areas, and Wald essentially said no. Let's reinforce the places where we don't find any bullets. And I think that's a very, I mean, again, I'm not going to go into the explanation of that, but just whether this was critical thinking or creative thinking, I don't know. Like, I can't make out the difference. And I think that's where I always think of it that way. And even pedagogically, it becomes very clear, like from what you said, that there are lots of, even the steps of teaching critical or creative thinking become very, very parallel. Okay, thanks a lot, Ritu. I think that was a great conversation, and maybe we do another episode on all the parallels between creative thinking and critical thinking, and some theories behind, why they are so similar, and then also delve a little bit deeper into if they are different, what are the differences as well. Thank you, everyone else. Thanks for watching, and if you liked what we shared, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and tell everyone about it. Thanks a lot. See you next time.